Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Claire Messoud discussing her latest book, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write, an autobiography in essays, and André Aciman discussing his new novel, Find Me, the sequel to Call Me by Your Name, now out in paperback. They are joined tonight in conversation by none other than James Wood. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk tonight, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Kant's Little Prussian Head or Find Me, there will be links in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this very difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you'd like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these past few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Claire Messoud is a recipient of the Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowship and the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She is the author of 7 books, including her best-selling novel, The Burning Girl. She is here to present her new essay collection, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write. Garth Greenwell called it a profound book about the intrication of literature and life, about the modest, miraculous way art helps us to live. André Aciman has a long list of best-selling books, including Call Me by Your Name, Out of Egypt, and The Enigma Variations. He is also a professor of comparative literature at the City University in New York. He is here to discuss Find Me. The Library Journal called it, or said about it, Aciman gives readers with a beautiful 21st century romance that reflects on the remembrance of things past and the courage to embrace the future. They are both joined tonight by James Wood, who is a book critic at The New Yorker and the recipient of the National Magazine Award in Criticism. He is also the author of multiple books, including the best-selling novel Upstate. James, Claire, Andre, thank you so much for being here tonight. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you. We turn ourselves on.
We do. We reappear.
Yes, here we are. I think I'm here. Yes, I am.
Wonderful.
Here
Thank
we are.
you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Audrey, for having
Audrey,
us. Thank you to the Harvard Bookstore.
Thank you. And it's a treat. It's a treat for me to interview Claire, to whom I'm married, because actually, strangely enough, that doesn't happen very often. And it's a treat to interview Andre, who I've never interviewed before in any public forum. So this is a real pleasure. And I do think this pairing works wonderfully in ways I hope that we can explore. But I thought I would start by asking you actually each a question, and I'll start with Claire, and it's about the titles of your books, which seem to me in different ways quite important. And if you would just talk about, Claire, first of all, the title Kant's Little Prussian Head, where you got that from and what it means.
Right. So the title actually comes from Thomas Bernhardt novel, and in fact the quotation involves, in other words, it's Kant's Little East Prussian Head, but it just seemed like too many words, so I cut that out. But what he's writing about is this fact that everything is sort of shrunk down and reduced, and he says, to a single sentence to a so-called philosophical hue. All of Kant's great work, what's actually transmitted is some vague flavor of it, rather than the immensity of it is impossible to capture. And I think, the literary or the artistic project really is that. It's Beckett, fail again, fail better. It's this sense that you're standing out in the rainstorm with your hands open, trying to catch all the water that falls, and you're obviously always failing. But on the other hand, words are so much better than nothing. We're so lucky to have at least that. And we do know something about what Kant thought. Even and we have a friend, James and I have a friend who spent 30 years on sort of one passage of Kant, and she knows quite a bit about what Kant thought, even if it's a tiny bit of what Kant thought.
I was going to ask you a question, if I may, because this is the beginning, and I don't. But do you think that every writer could be reduced to having like one song that he sings, and he sings it again and again and again, or she sings it again, but always in a different key, in a different way, so that you can't always tell that it's the same song? But actually, we all have. I think I have only one song. And I try to change it because it doesn't work for me to have it the same one. Otherwise, I don't have to write anything. But don't you think so?
Yes, although I guess I would say it's probably true, but maybe it doesn't have to be true. I can't, for example, I don't know enough about Kant, but I think he probably has a few songs.
That is true. That is so true.
He's kept so many people busy for so long.
I know, because there are two authors that philosophers that don't think I can understand. One is Kant and the other one is Spinoza. And they're very, very difficult. And I've tried, I really have tried. It's like, for me, it's like trying to learn German. It just is never going to work.
I remember when I was reading, this is years ago, Ray Monk's biography of Wittgenstein. Oh. And I said to James, I said, but when I read the Wittgenstein, I just can't understand it. And James said, don't worry, Bertrand Russell didn't either.
Andre, can I ask you, perhaps in relation to your title, you can get to that, but it was too tempting. When you said you have only one tune to sing, would you tell me what that tune is, and then perhaps relate it to the title of your latest book?
Well, it has something to do with the fact that we're not, I believe that human beings are not happy being human beings. I don't think we even belong to Earth, but we have to fake our way into pretending that we belong to Earth so that other people won't be outraged or think we're totally sick. But sometimes I ask my students, I say, how many of you think you're sick and twisted, but you've learned how to hide it? And of course, they all laugh, which means that they all agreed. And I think that we're all unhappy and not pathologically unhappy, but not quite happy. And I think we don't know, and this is really my song, we don't know how to be in the present. There are some people that I envy very much and say, I'm in the here and now, and I'm not in the past, I'm not in the future. I'm living day in, day out as it happens. And I don't know how to do that. I'm always either sort of regressing into the past or thinking about the past, things I should have done and didn't do or could have done better. And as for the future, I'm constantly fantasizing. So well, look, that's my song.
In Find Me, Elio's older lover, I hope I'm not giving things away to audience members, but Elio's older lover in Paris says, nothing belongs to the past. So just a little bit about that. I think it's actually a great theme in both work of your writing, but talk to me about nothing belongs to the past, particularly in relation to this difficulty of living in the present.
Well, I mean, there's a temptation, especially at the beginning of a relationship, to sort of close the doors on the past, which is the most beautiful thing about a romance, is that you are in the present. And in fact, one of the things that I've had happen in my books many times is that people don't want to consummate the relationship, because once they do that, it kind of begins to slip into something else. You want to always have the future being the tempting thing it is. And that's what Michel, the older man, does. They could have slept together the first night, but they didn't. He said, "Good night and nice knowing you," and
Yeah.
leaves. And the other one says, well, what happened? What did I do wrong? Why not? And I think that the doors to the past are suddenly closed. And that's the most beautiful thing in life. Because there's a promise of intimacy, there's a promise of magic. That's the word you use, Claire, the idea of magic as it happens in life. It
Mhm.
doesn't last long, but it's wonderful to try to keep it. It's like a candle in the wind. You try to protect it so that it won't be extinguished. And sometimes you burn it too long, which is another defect that I have. I've let things go on for too long. I should have consummated, and I didn't.
But what about this difficulty of living in the present? Because, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that most of us can't. I mean, I'd be interested, those few people who are fully and contentedly in the here and now, are they not haunted by the past? I mean, so in other words, what is it that what is the danger of what is it that makes living in the present so difficult?
Because we don't know. I mean, the present is basically it's what I call living directly under sunlight when you don't have a shadow. You're
Right.
in the present. And I've dealt with this in many ways, but the most significant one, and Claire, I know you will appreciate this because you come from so many other places. When I get together with a group of ex-Alexandrians,
Mhm.
the one thing we all do is sit and talk about, do you remember that movie theater? It closed, but do you remember this street? Do you remember this person? Do you remember this? And of course, at some point, somebody will wake up and say, enough with do you remember? We are in the United States. Enough of that. And I always admire the person who says that. I'm not that
Mm, that's interesting. Claire, I wanted to ask you about this, and I wondered if I could ask you to read a passage. I'm going to ask Andre to do that later too, but I wondered if you would just read the end of your introduction
one.
to the book when you talk about your grandfather, who spent a good deal of his retirement writing a long history. He spent his retirement in the past, writing a long history of his time in the 30s and 40s, and then your father, and the comparison of the two men, and how you find the image of those two men both absurd and hopeful.
Sure. It's just a paragraph, a
Yeah.
longish paragraph. Yep. My paternal grandfather spent the better part of a decade in his retirement writing a 1,500-page family memoir for my sister and me. He did not expect anyone else to read it. He titled it Everything That We Believed In. His undertaking was a gesture of faith in himself, in us, in language, and the transmissibility of experience. The result is an extraordinary and life-changing document. Nobody else need think so, but for me and for my sister, it is. My father, on the other hand, of more melancholic temperament, while a businessman during the day, spent his evenings, weekends, and holidays as a lifelong scholar and thinker who, like Bernhardt's account of Wittgenstein's nephew, remained a philosopher only in his head and committed nothing to paper. My abiding memory of him in age is of a man in his library, in his leather chair, in a pool of light, surrounded by darkness, wearing his half-moon glasses, with a book open on his lap and a scotch on the table beside him. He had nobody to talk to, with whom to share his considerable erudition. He lived in the splendid and terrible isolation of one who, while still retaining faith in the life of the mind and the power of books to speak to him, had renounced the possibility of being understood, the value of passing on his knowledge. Both figures have their Beckettian absurdity, my grandfather toiling at his desk, for what? My father reading voraciously alone, for what? But both also represent hope of a kind, and both inspire me to persist in my calling.
So in some ways, if you wanted to, you could see the study of those two men as studies in some discontent with the present. More so perhaps in case of your father than your grandfather. Perhaps your grandfather was contentedly living in the past while writing his memoir, huge memoir. But but what do they talk about this the absurdity and the hopefulness at once?
Well, I think it's interesting because the formulation which we've been talking about the past, or the past, the present, and the future, is absolutely true. But I think for me, I conceive of the sort of, if that's sort of linear in one way, I conceive of it in a different vector, which is interior versus exterior, sort of living in your head versus living in the world. And I think that's something that preoccupies me and always has. And this question of where reality is located, is reality here inside, or is reality, you know, when I interact with you, or is reality somewhere between us? You know, what actually is the present? Because of course, so much of what we experience in life is not articulated, and so it's present, but it's not in the world. And you know, there's that question of all that we carry within us. You know, I have this memory after my grandmother died, my French grandmother, and my grandfather was sitting in the chair that she always sat in, which was by the window overlooking the sea. And he was looking out the window, and I had this, you know, I was in my early 20s, and I had this sort of, and I said, "Oh, grand-père, what are you thinking about?" And I thought he was going to say, you know, "I was thinking about your grandmother." And he said, "I was thinking about visiting an oil well in the Sahara just after the Second World War." and it was this realization, you know, that all the days were in there, right? That all the days he had lived were in there, and that at any time he might be both, you know, in the room, in the present, and simultaneously somewhere else. And so I think and obviously in a different way, a book is just that, right? You're reading the book until somebody calls you to make dinner, and you go from you know, I don't know, scything with leaven to boiling soup, right? And you do that in 30 seconds, and you can go back again, and if you're clever, you can boil the soup while scything with leaven at the same time. You know, I mean, with Audible you can do that. So it's just,
yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
yeah. But so I think when I look at my both my father and my grandfather, what I mean, I'm talking Blue Street, but my father was very alone. You know, I mean, my mother was there, but in the sense that he had no tribe, he had no nation, he had no community. He was alone in that sense. There was nobody for him. He had his sister who never married. He had my mother, to whom he was married for a long time, but it was, you know, there were sort of points of failure to connect. And he had books, and those books were his companions, and that was he was still lonely, but that was incredibly important. Those were incredibly important conversations for him. And whereas I think, you know, my grandfather of a slightly different, my father was quite introverted and private, and my grandfather of a different temperament liked writing about his life and liked having people over for drinks, and, you know, it was a much more social world altogether. But both of them in some way, you know, words and literature as a mode of communication, as a mode of being in the world.
Andre, what's your feeling about that? The vector that Claire was talking about, not so much a linear one of sort of past and present, but a spatial one of inside and outside one's head.
Well, I have this metaphor that I've worked with quite a few times, but you can't, but you know, when you go to see a play sometimes in a very fussy, beautiful theater, they may not change the scenery, but they will bring a piece of furniture in. It will roll in magically. Another piece will come from the top down, and then the table that was there will suddenly sink into the ground. And so you have this sort of multi-tiered arrangement of things coming horizontally and vertically at the same time. And I think that this is for me the metaphor, the figure of how my mind is. In other words, I'm not really in one place. I think I am in many places, which explains why by nature I'm such a confused person. I mean, I don't look confused, I don't sound confused, but I'm emotionally and intellectually totally confused, you know, because I'm existing on many planes. And as in Claire's plane, and yours too, because you're not born here, you know, we exist in many lands, and there are many timescapes, and some have sort of shrunk, and others for some reason are expanding and taking over. I'm remembering my mother. Yesterday I was visiting someone who had a bowl filled with gardenias.
Mm.
And I'm not a big flower fan, but I smelled them, and of course I remembered my mother always had gardenias or gladiolas in the living room.
Mm.
Mm.
So suddenly I was, where's my mother? Of course, stop being Prussian. That is the first accusation. It doesn't work this way. But we have this sort of nether tier in us that is always bubbling up with other stuff that doesn't belong in the here and now. It's from elsewhere, and I think we're inhabited. And you're mentioning it, sort of cooking soup and reading about Levin scything the field, which I've never liked him as a character, but that's a different issue. Uh, but
He does a lot of scything.
yeah, you can do a lot of things at the same time, and therefore you're not in the moment. Our dishwasher has broken down, and we cannot find another one because they're not available. So I'm washing dishes every day, and as I'm washing dishes, I like to have music on,
Mm.
and I like to sing to the music. Sometimes I like certain songs and so on. And so I find myself, you're not doing the dishes, you're not focusing on the dishes, but you don't want to. You really want to do the songs, but you don't have the time to. So you're doing both at the same time. And it's this kind of constant, as I said, the furniture coming up and down and sideways. And uh, so you're always, you're not living life in the present. And I quote in my book, I think there's a wonderful line by Valéry, who was asked, why does he smoke? Because he smoked a lot. And he said, it's to put smoke between me and the world.
Mm.
And I think that writing for me is really an occupation that has a lot of dignity and a lot of seriousness, etc., etc. But it's really my way of basically finding something to do so I don't have to be outside in the real world.
Mm.
It's the way I hide. It looks fantastic because Andre is very busy writing, blah, 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 blah. But in point of fact, I'm just hiding away from everybody else. I like people, and I think people like me. But the other hand is that I don't know what to do in the real world.
You mentioned music, Andre. You have a wonderful, enigmatic, strange line towards the end of Find Me. And I realize as we mentioned Find Me that I still haven't got you to talk about the title yet. So I will come back to that. Um, in which you say, I think it's through Oliver's mind, but music is the unlived life. And it's such a strange, I think I know exactly what you mean. Music is the unlived life. I just wondered if you would expatiate on that a bit.
Well, it's one of those things that you write and you know it's right to do
Hmm.
it. In other words, but you're asking me to explain something that is unexplainable because it is the unlived life. In other words, I think that music is fundamentally the most perfect thing ever created on earth. In other words, it's more sophisticated than your best computer and your best iPhone 12, 11, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It is perfect. And I usually give the example of a Beethoven quartet, especially the late ones. They are perfect. Basically, that's it. And so you can compare yourself to it as a writer or even as a human being. You say, my God, this person is speaking to God, and I can barely mumble a prayer. I'm not a believer, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
but there it is. Basically, it's like the line of communication with the eternal is open to music, and you realize that the music is so perfect that what you are in comparison is a fledgling. You still haven't lived. You don't understand life.
Mm.
Music is already complete in and of itself. You are just basically, as I said, fledged. You're still inchoate.
Mhm.
Yes. And I
Mhm.
think that, and that's certainly very true. I mean, put aside unlived life, it's so true about how one feels as a writer when one hears music. That it's a constant reproach to us
Yeah.
as makers of half-made things,
I'm
right?
reminded of the
Um,
Flaubert line, which I will mangle. But I wanted to make music that would, what is it, something the stars, but I was the bear clanging.
On a kettle. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, Claire, you begin a lovely essay about a hunger for beauty, and indeed one in which you mention music, not surprisingly. You say, in these relentlessly dark and riven times, I find myself beset by a near ravenous hunger for beauty. And then you mentioned photography, a poem by Louise Gluck, music. Beauty is something that I associate with both of you as stylists, both things that you hunger for and chase, and that you enact as stylists. What was the prompt for that confession about a near ravenous hunger for beauty?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it was, well, there's a confluence of, I wrote it, I guess, a year and a half ago, maybe it was 2.5 years ago, but a confluence of things. I mean, I guess one being the sheer moral and spiritual hideousness of these years that we have been latterly have been living.
Mm-hmm.
But they, I think also for me, they come on the heels of, or the culmination of, a sort of ever more grotesque utilitarianism, that zealous utilitarianism that has been accelerating over the past 20 years, that is linked to technology, but to our understanding of technology, this idea that everything must be purposeful, that everything should be valuable in some measurable way, and we should be accountable, that, and it seems to me, I think it's in that piece that I say, what makes life worth living is the immaterial superfluity. It's the things that you can't actually evaluate in any practical sense. And if we used to know that, people used to know that, and now we don't, and it's disastrous, and the consequences down the line for our children who are young adults are disastrous. Just, it's neither here nor there, but my computer announced to me tonight that in the past 28 days, there have only been 4 days when I wasn't doing emails out of what would be considered work hours. So, and I think that I do less of that than most people I know. It's ridiculous. What happened to this 4-hour dinner, where you sat in the garden and went through 3 bottles of wine and solved the crises of the world with your friends? What happened to that? And it's the same thing that happened to sitting and listening to the music without doing the dishes. Right. And even seeing my friends, I walk around the pond with my friends, even before the pandemic, because you used to just hang out with your friends, but who has time to do that now? You have to be burning calories while you do it. It's ridiculous.
Yes, exactly. But you have a wonderful moment, I think, in one of the essays where you mentioned something that I have a full appreciation of. It's letter writing. When you were much younger, you used to write letters to your friends, and your friends would answer. It would take a few days. I had a pen pal, and I'd never met her, but she was English, and she lived in Sheffield, of all places, which I've been to. And
Did you meet her there?
Oh no, I did meet her. No, I don't even know if she's alive or not. But the point is that we used to write to each other sort of frenetically. In other words, every time I got her letters, I would write right back long epistles, and she would write back as soon as she got my letters. So it was a wonderful relation. It was basically not timed the way emails are and texts are. And I find that, yes, I'm out of the loop. I like to write emails that look like letters. I mean, many of us still do that. But also, I hate when people apologize for writing a long email.
Although I've had people say, wow, your emails are so long, and it kind of, oh. Yeah.
But there you have it. I want long emails. I mean, not the bureaucratic kind, but tell me about your life. The one letters that I used to hate, are letters that were composed to more than one person.
Mm.
And you can tell those are sort of mass mailers
Yeah.
that you recopy it all the time.
Like the holiday letter. The
Yes.
holiday letter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, this is what my family did. I don't want to ever correspond with you again. Anyway.
But I like that thing, I like what you said, Andre, not timed. That thing of being, and I think that does go back to the perfect piece of music or the poem that puts a circle around itself. The beauty of form is that it's a thing outside the timed, outside time. I think that's absolutely right. Perhaps Andre, you wouldn't mind reading, and then after you've read, because there's a passage I'd like you to read. Perhaps after you've read that, I want you to read it because it's such a good example of your own style, the beauty of your own style. But perhaps you then talk about the title "Find Me."
Okay, you're not going to let me off the hook about
No, I want. Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to read the passage that I think is sort of the most resonant one in the novel, and it's when Elio walks with his father and Miranda, and he basically takes them in Rome. They're walking through Rome, and they have this habit of doing what they call vigils. In other words, you go back to a place that you visited before because it reminds you of something erstwhile as well. In other words, it becomes sort of a multi-generational place that you revisit. And here it is. I'll read it now. When we reached Via della Pace, I thought he was about to take us to one of my favorite churches in the area. This is the father speaking. Instead, no sooner had we sighted the church than he made a right turn and took us to Via Santa Maria dell'Anima. Then, after a few steps, and just as I'd done with Miranda the day before, he stopped at a corner where a very old lamp was built into the wall. I never told you this, Dad, but I was drunk out of my mind one night. I had just vomited by the statue of Pasquino and couldn't have been more dazed in my life. Yet here, as I leaned against this very wall, I knew, drunk as I was, that this, with Oliver holding me, was my life. That everything that had come beforehand with others was not even a rough sketch or the shadow of a draft of what was happening to me. And now, 10 years later, when I look at this wall under this very old street lamp, I am back with him, and I swear to you, nothing has changed. In 30, 40, 50 years, I will feel my life, I will feel no differently. I have met many women and more men in my life, but what is watermarked on this very wall overshadows everything I've known. When I come here to be here, I can be alone or with people, with you, for instance, but I'm always with him. If I stood for an hour staring at this wall, I'd be with him for an hour. If I spoke to this wall, it would speak back.
It's wonderful. So find me. It's a phrase that recurs throughout the book, and it's spoken by characters. It's also just woven into the texture of the sentences. What is being found? What is being sought, and what is being found?
It's the plea that we all have when we're in love with someone, and for some reason there's a difficulty in connecting or in communicating, or you've lost touch, but you haven't really. So that what you really are hoping is that this other person is going to make the first move, and the other person is going to come looking for you, i.e., finding you. Please find me. I'm here. I'm waiting. And there's a wonderful moment when Elio says, I know he thinks of me precisely because he's not writing to me. Just as he knows I'm always thinking of him when I'm not writing to him. This is, I think, the ultimate sort of enigma of all love, is that have they stopped thinking of me now that quite a few years have gone by, or are they continuing to think of me as I know they are, but they're not saying anything? It's actually it's sort of arrogant, yes, but at the same time We know it's true.
Yeah, yeah. And just we can talk about other things. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but it's a tricky thing to write a book that complements, teases out the lives of characters in an earlier book, and most writers are, I think they're afraid of doing it. I know Marilyn Robinson has now done it in several iterations, and but most writers don't, because I think it seems so challenging.
It is challenging. And when I finished Call Me By Your Name, and we're talking about more than 10 years ago, I had a thought. I was writing another book, which I was completely devoted to. But after finishing that book, I decided I was going to go back to Call Me By Your Name, because there was still business to be done. And so I wanted to have an Elio who was 20 years old or 22 years old, still in college. And then I said, what is he going to do? They're not going to replay Call Me By Your Name. They've already slept together. And most of the action was because they didn't know how the other felt. Right. So I felt that, what is that to do? So I tried writing it, and it wasn't coming along. And it was only many years later when I decided to go back to the character. And it came more or less adventitiously, because I wasn't thinking of writing a sequel, but I was writing about an older man who's on a train, who meets this woman. And then I just said he's going to meet his son also. And then I said, who is the son going to be? I know who the son has to be. And at that point, I realized I was writing about the same characters, but in totally different contexts. Although I knew that the thing that was teasing me was, I mean, I was kind of deferring it constantly. And I don't want to give a spoiler, but I think most people know at this point. It's basically, I was not allowing myself to go where I wanted to go, right, until the very, very end.
Right. But you did, finally.
I did, yes.
So Andre, I want to ask you a question about that, which is that because it's very beautiful, and it's romantic, and it's optimistic, and I wonder, is that how you believe life is, or how you wish life were?
I think that, no, I don't think life works along our wishes. That doesn't sort of make our wishes come true. That would be too beautiful if it did that all the time. But I am, in many respects, a sort of a closet optimist. I don't allow myself to be an optimist because I'm from the Middle East, and people from the Middle East are very cautious when they're optimistic, because they know the evil eye is hovering around you and it's going to destroy you and basically frustrate everything you want. So you sort of push it away. But at the bottom, I believe that every catastrophe that has happened in my life has turned out to be for the better. It's not that I fixed it in such a way that it became better. It's just that's how my life has been so far. Notice how I have all these privatives built in. But in point of fact, every time I've lost a job, when I was much younger, I used to work on Wall Street. If I lost a job, that was a bad thing at the time, but then it was a fantastic thing because I did something else. And then I get closer and closer to what I wanted to do. So, when I lost a girlfriend, God, I found another one who was 10 times better. So life was like that. So far it's been that way. So
I should say to the audience that feel free to use the Q&A or the chat thing at the bottom of the screen to ask some questions, and I'll be happy to read them out in a few minutes' time. Claire, when Andre was reading out the passage about the wall being watermarked, and Elio feeling that he could stand there and that he was immediately had access to that moment, and perhaps this is interesting precisely in relation to optimism or pessimism. I was thinking of the end of your lovely memoir about your father dying, and the evocation of the Beirut that he knew as a child, where you end by saying something about, I can't remember exactly what you write. I've got it written in notes here. a place for which I have in my diary his neatly folded map, but to which I can never go. You had been there, but quite a lot of the essay is taken up with your understanding that you cannot be in the same city as your father was.
No, there was a major civil war and a lot of
Right.
destruction in between.
But so then I think the question is can the walls be watermarked then? I mean, there could be, I suppose, there can be for a lover who standing there in Rome, but it would seem at the end of your essay that you're saying almost the opposite.
No, I don't think I was saying the opposite, really. I actually, it's interesting. I think that in that beautiful passage that you read, Andre, it is true of lovers, but it's also just true of life, and of this, the stories that were told, as well as the things that we experience. That and the literature that we read. I mean, I think all of those things inflect places and make them into a palimpsest that you can't. I mean, a sort of very obvious example would be something, for me at least, somewhere like Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where you feel like, oh, and this is my, I was here as a student and my parents courted here, and Sartre and de Beauvoir sat in the cafe and were rude about people here, and and you can go back and back and back, and then Hemingway was here, and Gertrude Stein was here, or whatever, and Picasso was here. I guess maybe they were in Montparnasse, but you know what I mean. That cities get that palimpsetic overlay fairly powerfully, and certainly, if you walk through Paris and then you suddenly see the bullet holes in the walls where where the resistance fighters, or when they were fighting for the liberation of Paris. I mean, that those things affect one very powerfully. But there are also, when I was going to Beirut, it was when my father was dying, and he drew me this map, and there were these things that didn't change. So the rocks, the pigeon rocks, and where Ashrafi is, and so on. But then he put the names of stores, right? And of course, the stores hadn't existed since perhaps 1945 or maybe 1950, and that you can't go back to. So I have the map for the city that he was a child in, but
So I suppose the question I'd have for both of you then is, if you can't, he couldn't go back, really. I mean, he physically could go back, but
il faut tourner la page.
Right, the city had already changed. You couldn't go back.
Yeah.
It was a map you folded up. So what is the watermark then?
Oh, the watermark is you don't see it, but it's a watermark is, I mean, I love the idea of a watermark, but I want to come back to something that Claire was saying and that I read in the book. Basically, when you showed him, was it pictures of the street that he was sort of, you took pictures and you showed him the picture and he sort of waved them away, like, I'm not interested. This is not what I want. In other words, even if of course, it's totally changed, so he doesn't recognize it, it means nothing. And that happens to us. But watermark is something that it's what paper has. I mean, it's not incidental that I use that metaphor, because in every page of every sort of the papers that you even Xerox has a watermark in it. And you don't see the watermark, but it's there and it's there. In other words, you don't see the wall and it doesn't say anything to you, but you know that all you have to do is stand and stare. Just stand and stare at something, and something will sort of percolate. It will disappear like a smell 2 seconds later, but you will have seized something. And then you basically have to sniff some coffee grinds or whatever it is. And then you look at it again and it will come back. And eventually nothing happens, of course. But I treasure those moments when, I mean, there's a wall in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that every time I go there and I stand by that wall, I know who I kissed, and I know where she is, and I know what she's doing. And she may not be in that wall, she may not be in this city, she may not be in this country, but the wall speaks to me. And I take pictures of it every single time.
Oh, that's beautiful. One of the things I have to say, one of the things Claire knows well that I miss in America, just as a lack, as a texture that isn't there, is old walls. I really absolutely love old walls. We have some questions. So, and there's a question for each of you. I'll start with a question for André. André, I was struck by the fact that when you speak about wanting to wait to consummate a relationship and then letting relationships go on too long, you're actually talking about a problem of narrative, where a story begins, where a story ends. Do you think about the rise and fall of relationships and the narrative structure of fiction in similar ways?
Well, that's a difficult question. Thank you very much. Okay. No, I do think that, for example, I never know how to end anything I write. I usually there's like a tourniquet effect or like a little twist that I need to insert because I don't know how to end some things. And you will notice that all my endings of all my books, and I never do it intentionally, but it gives me the kind of music that I need. They're always written usually in the conditional mood. In other words, it's never in the present tense, it's in the conditional. We would do this, we would have done that, that should have happened. And the optative, the conditional, the subjunctive, whatever you want to call it. And I think that that's how I write. In other words, I begin a story, and I never know where a story is going to go. I know there are certain moments that I love in a story, and then I just linger on them because I know that this gives me pleasure. But then I have to let go of them, and then I have to find new moments like this. And eventually a plot sort of comes about. I'm very bad with plot, so that's why my novels never have plot. I mean, they have something like a plot, but it's not really plot driven. And more or less what I really love is a conversation between two individuals, very much in the style of a French film. That's what I like. And usually it's a confiding moment between two characters, and I love that. But then as the plot sort of begins to become bigger and bigger and swells, I don't know what to do with that. I have to end it because it really doesn't interest me, and I don't know how to end it. So I usually have a kind of cute ending, and people say, explain to me what happens to the character afterwards. I said, I don't know. And
Claire, there's a question from Valerie Werder. She asks, Claire, this idea of your grandfather writing a book for only you and your sister is incredible. And I almost think that many books are sneakily written as kind of a desperate attempt to communicate with just one person or a select few people. It's another way of thinking about Kant's Prussian head problem. All these reams of paper trying to communicate a simple but impossible thing to the right person. Have you ever felt this when writing? How does fiction secretly addressed to a particular you compare with fiction written for a general anonymous you?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question about the specific you. And people often ask the question, I'm sure they ask you, Andre, I'm sure they ask you, James, do you have a particular reader in mind when you're writing?
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm asked that question, the answer is no, I don't.
Mm.
So which isn't the same, I think, as it being, I don't know how to answer that. I feel as though I know exactly what you mean, but I think to write for someone specific is quite different from not doing. And I don't know. I mean, the people who answer and say, I try to think of a reader like so and so, a generic reader. I don't, that fits certain parameters. That doesn't make any sense to me. It does make sense to me that somebody would write for a specific reader. It's just that I don't think I do. And I do think, we were talking before we came on with Andre about letter writing and the importance of, or it was after we started anyway, but letter writing. And I think, that's very important to me, the idea that there's a particular address to someone that you're from, there's the title of Ye Yun Lee's wonderful memoir, but that I'm going to mangle. But from my life, I write to you in your life. I mean, I think that idea of a communication from one psyche to another, But actually, for me at least, the fictional experience is rarely actually that. I don't know. Andre, what about you?
Um, I try to, I mean, there's always someone that you hope will read this, but you kind of disembowel that person, that identity. It becomes frayed at the edges to the point where it's no longer that person. That person may have sort of impelled you to begin the thing, but otherwise, but as you write, some you begin other things take over. So sometimes it's just the necessity of creating a story in a particular way takes over. But sometimes it's a character who's too dominant and that takes over. But the very beginning, the initial sort of impulse to write something is usually for me a person.
Mm-hmm.
But that gets sort of, so as I said, disemboweled. That person no longer can even recognize himself, herself. In fact, most people never recognize themselves. In fact, when you make fun of a character, they will never recognize themselves.
Well, I find they recognize themselves in where they aren't for
Oh, they aren't. Yes, okay.
for very weird reasons. Like this
Oh,
person who likes spaghetti bolognese, it's me, right? And you think, no, that person, I didn't have you in mind for a second.
Well,
But
here's a related question from Teju Cole, who asks, question for both, related to the previous question, who has read you best? I suppose I'm asking for an anecdote, if you have one, of someone who read you in a way that particularly moved you. I like that question, though it could be that neither of you has felt particularly well read in that regard.
Claire?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Teju, I would say I had that experience with someone who's now our colleague, which is Neil Mukherjee. I think who reviewed The Emperor's Children in London before I ever met him, and I felt, here's somebody who actually understood what I was trying to do. And I think, you know, the challenge with reviews is that even when they're nice, they very often don't seem to understand what you were trying to do. And sometimes there are not nice reviews that understand what you were trying to do and feel you didn't do it. And at least you feel that's an engagement that you are grateful for and respect. And it's not that you're not grateful for the nice ones that don't get what you were trying to do, but it's actually pretty rare to have somebody you don't know seem really to be in conversation with you. And I did have, you know, I think the most profound experience I had of that was with someone who I now have the great good fortune to have as a colleague in the creative writing department at Harvard. So,
Andre.
I find that basically I'm the kind of person, for example, I'm the kind of writer that if you edit me, as I've handed in a manuscript, you're editing it. Every edit you suggest, I will accept. Everything that you say should be cut, I will cut. Because I'm extremely deferential. I'm very, very insecure as a person. But to go to the reader, I've been lucky in the sense that I've had many readers who say, this is who you really are, isn't it? And I love when somebody gets me, totally get me, basically to the point where they've kind of undressed me. They've sort of gotten all of my secret chambers. They've identified many aspects of myself. Of course, they can't know you altogether, just as even I can't know myself altogether. But I love when I'm known. And when somebody says, I
oh, did Andre freeze?
I think he froze, but he'll come back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I have a question we'll come back to Andre. I have a question from Claire for Claire from Ann Arbor. Thinking of your dog essay here, I just got a dog and I'd like to know how having dogs has impacted your process as a writer. Your former student, Julia.
Hi, Julia. I hope you're really well. I'm impressed that you have a dog, and how exciting. Well, dogs make you go walking. That's really important. They get you away from your desk. depending on what kind of dog, they're also demanding. So so that may negatively impact your work. But you know, I think the tradition of writers with dogs is an estimable and long one. There's that Edith Wharton quote about her dog where she says that doesn't is something like that little heartbeat at my feet. Um, yeah, I think James also can attest to the fact that the dogs are both the boon and the bane. Uh,
I like that.
yeah, they're both things.
I have a question here from Mary Clack, which was for both Claire and Andre, and maybe Andre in some alternative universe is hearing this question, though it seems that he's not able to answer it. But it's a good question, I think. How does the experience of yearning that we feel more acutely during Corona time affect your literary sensibility?
That's
right. It is interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I mean, I think I do experience yearning for human companionship. I mean, I'm very lucky to live with the other fellow there on the screen, but and our daughter's at college, but our son is here. But the thing is, no.
Sorry, I got interrupted. I don't know what happened.
Not to worry, Andre.
Can you find your thread? Do you think? Do you know where you were?
No, because I have no idea where it froze.
So I'll just key you in, Andre. Claire's just answering a question, which was to both of you, about how the experience of yearning for something very acutely has been affected by the Corona time, and so Claire.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, I certainly feel a lot of yearning, but I'm not sure how it's affected my literary sensibility. But I actually think, Andre, I would love to know your answer to this, given that, you know, what you were saying earlier about yearning being an important part of.
I'm sorry, I'm not. Oh.
Can you hear us or no?
That's all right.
Okay, I hear you now. I'm so sorry.
Not at all.
Different computer, that's why.
Not at all. So this was just a question. It was a question about how yearning for something has been affected by the pandemic, as it obviously has, and presumably, I mean, that's the case for all of us, but I think the question was particularly how it affected has it affected your literary sensibilities?
I don't think it has. It has. The pandemic has been. I mean, of course, you don't want to sound very privileged, but at the same time, the pandemic has allowed me to focus on writing. The thing that I yearn for the most, or long for, is dinner with friends. That is something that I miss terribly. I still have them, but they're so orchestrated and sometimes dysfunctional because you have to sit apart from each other and you have to find a place that's in the open air, and so you know it's not easy, but I do miss that, and I miss playing music for my friends when we're having dinner. I love that, and I in fact I've stopped drinking scotch, which is one of the things that I adore, and like your father, Claire, but I like to offer my friends the best scotches that are available. So I miss all that. That's something I do miss.
Here's a final question from Peter Sachs to both Claire and Andre. Since your sense of time, especially past time, is perhaps even more spatial than temporal, I'm wondering if you feel that your senses of time have changed over the years, or at least since you started writing. Claire.
Since I started writing, I don't know. I can't remember before I didn't write, so I really don't know. I mean, you know, even as a kid, I wrote, and I think my sense of time is very much bound up with that, with the fact that there was always writing. I mean, that really is, for my whole life, there was reading and writing, and I think my sense of time is changed because of that. And I think I'm someone who, that question, you know, that we were talking about earlier on, and Andre, about living in the present or being in the present, I feel that I have a problem that I'm too much in the present. You know, sort of the Buddhist thing is be here now, and I feel like I'm always too much here now. I feel I'm always noticing too many things and worrying about too many things, and you know, I'm the neurotic in the now. But I also can't really believe that the past is past, because it isn't past for me. I feel that the past is with me. And I think one of the things for me, at least, of getting older and losing people, is that the people who are gone are also with me. And I feel that, you know, that if as it were the great ballroom in my head were made manifest, it would be a noisy and busy peopled place. So in that sense, but I think that's very much related to living in literature. I think that's very much related to believing in the reality of stories, and the fact that even if it is Kant's little Prussian head, even if it is a mere philosophical hue, that when you tell the story, you capture something and you convey something. And so experiences that, you know, Andre, experiences that your grandmother had, you are conveyed to me. And isn't that a miracle that you know, that extraordinary, your amazing book Out of Egypt, that those people who really lived, who you knew and loved, and you know, that even some portion of them is in my heart and in my imagination. It seems miraculous to me.
Oh, thank you for that, Claire. Really, all I can say to that is that, you know, I don't think we actually know how to live in the present, but we're compelled to. We don't have a choice. So we do things that, you know, we work, we travel, we eat, we make phone calls, emails. This is all in the present. One of the things that I discovered while I was writing Out of Egypt many years ago now is that there comes a point in life where you realize that once you're dead, the next generation will remember you. The generation after that will remember you in one way or another. But by the fourth generation, you might as well never have lived, which is, I think, the ultimate catastrophe. So one of the reasons why I wrote Out of Egypt was to bring back all these phantoms, these people who had already died, and to basically, I wanted to live with them some more. And the only way to do that is through writing. In other words, basically, I call it dumping. You know, basically, whatever you have in your head, you want to make it real again, and you dump it on paper. Paper is very sort of disloyal as a form, because it changes everything for you. And maybe that's why you write, because you're hoping that it will be changed in some way that you can live with it. One of the wonders, you remember that wonderful line by Somerset Maugham when he said, "Thank God I don't have to write prose anymore." He was doing plays at the time, and very successfully. He said, "I don't have to write prose anymore. I don't have to describe a sunset anymore." Because, of course, if you're a writer of prose, you've described the sunset, you've described the sea many times, and you're doing it in the new book where you describe the luminosity of the sea. And you try to capture that every single time in a different way. But fundamentally, you're trying to rivet it on paper in one way or another, so that you can maybe, and this is the ultimate arrogance of a writer, is to pass it on, not to the next generation, but to the one after that one.
I think that's a beautiful place to end, and you know, but you say eloquent words which I know are true for both of you, and ideals for both of you, and thank you very much, Claire Messuд and André Aciman.
Thank you,
Thank you so much.
James.
This is such a lovely talk. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for just sharing your time with us. It's really important that we continue to talk about literature and art, and this has been such a lovely talk. And for everyone whose questions we didn't get to, I'm sorry, we just didn't have enough time, but thank you all for showing up, for authors, publishers, any book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. Check out the links in the chat if you are interested in purchasing tonight's books, and please remember to shop indie and shop local. To all of you watching at home, and to those of you who've spoken with us tonight, Be well. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I
Bye-bye.
want to ask a question.